This is surveying Salmon Falls, or actually what I should have called it was, or how I occupied myself during the first half of the pandemic. So Salmon Falls, so a little bit of background, I've been poking around the history of Rollinsford, but more specifically the village of Salmon Falls in the mill complex that's there for over, I hate to say it, 30 years now. And at the beginning of the pandemic, because there was not much else to do, I started doing two things. One is I started going through my boxes of files and actually organizing them. And two, I started poking around online because a lot of repositories across the country are now digitizing their collections, and it's giving all of us unprecedented access to materials and archives that you would have had to have traveled down to, in this case, some places like Philadelphia or New York to access. And that proved to be incredibly fruitful as well. And then I realized how much I'd forgotten that I knew. Information that I'd read, but then sort of went in one ear out the other. So I started creating these living documents and sharing them on social media called every Sunday, called Salmon Falls Sundays, and just going either building or resource. And it's sort of a mind dump of sort of architecture and history for those different resources. So what we're going to do today is take a look at this, like, why do we do survey? What does that mean? And then, we're going to look at an overview of the mill complex. How did the village develop to where it is? And then also look at some new information about the Boston and Maine Railroad Bridge, which is a really interesting structure that is in the downtown. And then what's sort of really exciting following that, there's some incredible new information that has come forward about St. Mary's that allows us to understand so much better the development of that building, and also what it used to look like and what happened before certain changes were made, which we'll be sharing as well. So what is survey? And survey is something that I'm not doing well right now. One moment, my notes are coming up. So good survey is like the cornerstone of historic preservation. If you're going to do a historic preservation project, a good solid project always begins with survey. And what surveys does is it combines research and knowledge to give you information on what you have for buildings and landscape. Why is it significant? What changes have occurred, and what changes that have occurred, are those significant? Do they reflect important changes in history? Because you're going to connect all of this to local, regional, and national contexts that relate to that building or that landscape and its history. And using that information, you can then make educated decisions as you work on a building or as you make plans as a community as to what things you really want to preserve and where can you manage change and allow change to happen while retaining historic character. It's the cornerstone of what people in historic preservation do. Without survey, you're just sort of mucking around with old stuff. I'm lucky that I've built off the shoulders of some incredible survey that occurred for the village of Salmon Falls. And that includes work by Gordon Grimes, who wrote The Portrait of Salmon Falls, which appeared in the now defunct New Hampshire Profiles magazine in the 1970s. He was working for the Rockingham and Stratford County Regional Planning Commission at the time, and was doing work with that commission and created the Salmon Falls, the Mill Village Historic District Study, which also is a great resource to understand the downtown and why it's important as a historic resource. Also building off the shoulders of Dr. Richard Candy, who is the retired head of the Preservation Department at Boston University, who wrote the Salmon Falls Mill Historic District National Register nomination back in 1979. And Dr. Jim Garvin, the retired state architectural historian who did the National Register nomination for Rollinsford Town Hall. And then also Lynn Monroe of Preservation Company and Paul Mirsky did work early on with a tax credit project when Daymark came to town and added to the wealth of knowledge that we knew up until this point about the village. So just an overview of the village. I love this photograph taken from South Berwick, from behind Fogarty's, looking down or up the river. to the village of Salmon Falls, because it really exemplifies that idea of the machine in the garden. You have this industrial complex and the village of housing and buildings that supported it, surrounded by open fields and cow pastures. It's very pastoral, and it's the machine in the garden is the title of a 1967 publication by Dr. Leo Marx that identifies this trope in 19th century American literature of the tension between the pastoral and the industrial in the 19th century. And Salmon Falls really exemplifies that aspect of American history. We have industry and agriculture really cheek to jowl, and still read that way, even when I was a kid, when you still had active cow pastures adjacent to the mill village. So I love this map. This is a map circa 1835 in the collection of the Old Berwick Historical Society. And what you're seeing here, can everyone see my pointer? Hopefully you can. What you're seeing here is the early mill village of the 1830s. This is Main Street, right here, and the wooden boarding houses, that some of which survive on that street. Over here, that's the Colonel Paul Wentworth Mansion and its associated barn. And here you can see this road that connects the mill village all the way down along the riverbank. Griffin's factory or nail factory right here, that's where the American Legion is today. And what was called the Willow Walk, this causeway that cut across this mill pond that then connected Salmon Falls to the tidal portion of the Salmon Falls River where their dock was, because this is before the railroad. And so everything had to be carted in and carted out and loaded onto gondolas and then sailed down to Portsmouth and then to markets elsewhere. Now, in the years preceding the industrial development of the middle or Salmon Falls of the Salmon Falls River, the natural waterfall supported small-scale industry with grist, saw, and fulling mills. In 1822, James Runlet of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, purchased the mostly vacant land surrounding the falls, including $5,500 for the Salmon Falls water privilege. He then incorporated what became the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company with the states of New Hampshire and the newly formed state of Maine. In December of 1822, he sold his property in water privileges at Salmon Falls to the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company for $100,000. Runlet was sort of elevating himself out of a debt situation, and this set him pretty well. The improvements that were then made, a newspaper article later claimed in 1834, cost about $300,000 to build all the mills and everything. By October 22nd, of 1822, the Portsmouth, New Hampshire's Gazette reported the new brick buildings nearly completed in the rear for carting and spinning, a second building 60 feet by 31 feet, 3 stories by 4 for weaving, dressing, and fulling, capable of making 200 yards of superfine broadcloth a day, a third 60 by 30 feet, 2 stories for drying. The same article reported it was believed the waterfall could host a total of 20 such factories in this location. Runlet hired Colonel William Boardman, originally from Haverhill, New Hampshire, as engineer who served as the company's architect. Along with the mills, the company owned and constructed a sawmill, grist mill, oil mill, and fulling mill, a large store, blacksmith shop, 3 dwelling houses, 3 workshops, and 3 barns. 2 dams span the river, and the article credited the company with construction of a handsome, substantial bridge constructed over the stream and a new road leading to South Berwick Corner. The New Hampshire Gazette reported the mill building's architecture and design conferred great honor on Colonel Boardman, the engineer. Boardman was a well-known engineer of his time. He was born in Haverhill, Massachusetts in 1787. In A History of Nashua, published in 1895, it was reported that he was educated in public and private schools of his day and thoroughly qualified himself as a civil engineer. Boardman worked as an engineer out of Haverhill, Mass, and may have met Runlet at Amesbury, where Runlet had previously invested in woolen mills. He left Salmon Falls in 1823 for Nashua, New Hampshire, where he stayed for the remainder of his career and is credited with locating the company's canal, mill buildings, and tenement blocks. He was a very well-known person regionally, a well-known engineer regionally, and an expert on mills by the time he died in 1856. And we were one of his early commissions. Funded mostly by investors out of Portsmouth, the company also owned a small farm that included cultivated fields, part of an orchard, hay fields, and pasture. Interesting to note, local historian and writer Annie Wentworth Baird claimed the company grew teasels, which are a plant that is used to comb wool in preparation for spinning into fabric. And she also claimed that in the late 19th century, occasional teasels would still grow up in the area near the Salmon Falls Railroad Depot. And in the 20s and 30s, other buildings were constructed, including additional housing, an agent's house, a schoolhouse, an Episcopal church. Runlet stayed on as agent until 1823. He was replaced briefly by Ebenezer Bell, who then was replaced by Portsmouth native Joshua Pierce. And under Pierce's management, the mill buildings constructed by the company performed well. And by the early 1830s, it employed 221 people, producing 52,600 yards of cloth annually, which is approximately 7% of all woolen broadcloth woven in the United States at that time. Colonel Pierce was educated at Phillips Exeter Academy. He worked for a while in the counting houses of Portsmouth and also served in the Gilman Blues Military Company. The success was short-lived. On August 7th, 1834, a fire started in the picker located in one of the mill buildings, which resulted in the loss of life of 3 women. One of the first steps in textile manufacturing, a picker machine beats the wool and cotton fibers to loosen them up, and then uses rollers to remove any foreign matter that form the fibers into a lap, which is sort of that first step into creating the thread that then is woven into cloth. Picker machines were a likely source of fire in textile mills and regulated usually in separate buildings. The fire completely destroyed one mill, extensively damaged 2 others, and consumed the company's counting house and a large boarding house that stood on the corner of what's now Main and Front Streets. Writing to a friend in Albany, New York, Agent Pierce referred to the fire as a terrible disaster and lamented the death of 3 young women and the closing of the mill that led to the displacement of the village inhabitants. In its report on the fire, the Great Falls Journal wrote the village had reason to fear that the woolen manufacturing business is ended in this town forever. And they were right. In 1836, 2 years after the fire, the corporation's investors brought Agent Pierce back to supervise the construction of a new mill. This is the mill that you see right now, for cotton production instead of woolen production. And by 1843, the Factory Girls album, which was published in Exeter, New Hampshire, wrote that the village had a mill 250 feet in length, 50 feet deep, 5 stories high with an attic, running 12,000 spindles, with 264 looms in operation, manufacturing drilling and sheetings and employing 400 hands. So that's the mill that you see right there. The company is now erecting an additional dam, which will give them double the power now used. And it's not clear if this is the dam that the company built in the 1820s or the upper dam that existed when they acquired the water privileges at Salmon Falls. An 1840 inventory of the property shows the company owned the factory as described, a 3-story machine shop, a dye house, 2 drying houses, counting room with attached cloth and storage area, and a storehouse in brick. They also owned a wool house, finishing house, agent's house, barn, blacksmith, lumber house, and engine house, all wood framed. Most of these buildings were clustered in the area occupied by mill number 1 today, and both this and the previous mill ran on water power. A dam created a mill pond with a head of water that was then funneled into an open canal. From the canal, sluiceways channeled the water into penstocks, and then a series of water wheels that powered the machinery with a power train made out of leather belts and metal gears, wheels, and shafts. The water then dumped into a tail race and was returned to the river. In 1844, Boston investors purchased the company, Mason and Lawrence, which was a company out of Boston made up of Boston Means Mason, who was actually a Portsmouth native who then moved to Boston to seek his fortune, and Amos Adams Lawrence, who was of the very prosperous Lawrence family, who had made a fortune in the 18th century. Both invested in a variety of different textile mills. And in 1844, they then purchased from the investors in Portsmouth the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company. And after the sale of the company in 1844, they and their Boston, Massachusetts-based investors began expanding the village and creating the footprint that survives today. The early years of the corporation were very profitable for the new investors. And the years before the construction of Mill Number 2 in 1848, the company began efforts to raise money and reported to its stockholders that at Salmon Falls, the water power is the same at Great Falls, that's Somersworth, where there are 55,000 spindles. It is below Great Falls on the same river. The fall is 40 feet. The present mill is well built and cost nearly as much as now given for the whole property, which they said is $60,000. There's land and water enough for 2 more mills of the same size. In the 1840s, they first built new housing, the brick boarding houses and duplexes on 2nd and South Street. And I added this. This is obviously, this photo is not of the houses from that time period. Or I shouldn't say isn't from the time period when those were built. But what I wanted to show is this is a duplex that experienced a fire in 1984. And if you look, what's interesting about the housing is the masonry buildings are not load-bearing masonry walls. They're brick veneer built over a timber frame. And here you can see where the sidewall has failed and the timber frame of that building sits open and exposed. Where it sat like that, you could still see this for about 10 years after this fire. To the left of that photo is Mill Number 2 in 1851, soon after its construction. Now, efforts to raise the needed capital to build this mill were successful, and in July of 1847, the stockholders authorized the company directors to construct a second mill. And on August of that year, the directors authorized plans for a mill of 16,000 spindles. Construction began that winter, and in order to accommodate the mill's foundation, the existing vehicular bridge over the Salmon Falls River was removed, and a new bridge constructed further upriver, where the current bridge is today. Construction of the mill continued throughout 1848, and on March 9 of 1849, the company ran water through the mill's flume for the very first time. Upon completion, Mill Number 2 was one of the most impressive buildings in the village, and an excellent example of Greek Revival architecture. When it was completed, the Thursday Sketcher, published out of Somersworth, New Hampshire, wrote an article with a lithographic image. They enthused with the Victorian hyperbole that the new factory is more elegant in outward appearance and interior finish than any similar building in America. The Industrial Revolution brought substantial physical and societal changes to America, and this change was often met with rural New England with distrust and fear. In the construction of the mill and other buildings from this period, the mill's Boston owners strove to present in architecture the respectability and desirability of the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company to the local population. The same article in the Sketcher cited above reiterated that this to the public as it reported, earnest efforts have been put forth from the beginning, not only by gentlemen connected with the corporation, but by the citizens generally to establish a thoroughly moral and highly intellectual community. And we dare say confidentially, there is no village in New England in any good sense more attractive. Gentlemen connected with the corporation at Salmon Falls are actively engaged in liberally supporting religious worships, and their influence is most salutary. Unlike Mill Number 1, which was powered by water wheels, Mill Number 2 was built to run off of a Boyden turbine. Designed to run off of one turbine, the mill was actually built with 2 in order to provide backup if the main turbine failed. And this is early. The earliest turbine use is in 1844 in Lowell. And there is a drawing for that turbine for Mill Number 2 by Uriah Atherton Boyden in the collection of the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Boyden, who was from Foxborough, Mass., was a hydraulic engineer who designed the Boyden turbine in 1845 for Lowell. He then worked for the Muskeg Manufacturing Company in Manchester. Interestingly enough, the turbines were installed in 1848, and then in 1849, James B. Francis improved on the design, creating a turbine that was over 90% more efficient. So they were groundbreaking at the time, but then they were soon outdated. And then just to show you, by the time all of this work is done, this is a map of Salmon Falls Village in 1851. Here's Main Street right here. The Colonel Paul Wentworth Mansion would be over here. Mill number 1 is down below, mill number 2 here, Front Street, the agent's house. You can see the village looks pretty much like it does today. The footprint of the village is there. In July of 1864, the company experienced a second disastrous fire that began in mill number 1, again in the picker. The fire resulted in the death of a young boy, and while at one point at least 30 buildings in the village were on fire, the total loss of buildings only included the mill and some supporting buildings around it, the agent's house, a large brick block on the corner of Front and South Streets. In 1865, the company constructed a new mill number 1, a modest example of the Italianate style, in the same location as the 1836 mill. The new building was approximately 240 feet long by 50 feet wide, had 4 stories in the front, 5 facing the river, with a gravel-covered roof. Originally included a picker house on its south end and a machine room at its north, but these were modified and enlarged into textile production space in the 1880s, after the company built a new machine hall across the street from this mill and added another floor to the picker on mill number 2. And this is from a Barlow insurance map of 1870, and it's great because it not only gives us what the mill looked like when it was originally built, but it also provides us what was used and how things operated, which is fantastic. And here you can see 1871 with the new mill in place. Down below, once again, some more construction in the village, and even better shown in this bird's eye view of 1877 of the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company. And what's interesting that we see in these maps too is by the 1870s, we have not just one railroad, the B&M, but the former Portsmouth, Great Falls, and Conway Railroad, which came in later in the 1850s, is shown here as well as the 3 churches, the Episcopal Church right here, number 6, the Catholic Church, number 5, and then the Congregational Church, number 4. In the 1880s, more modifications were made. Not only did we modify mill number 1, but the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company modified mill number 2. The mill roof was partially removed and its dormers replaced with a full monitor that runs the length of the building, with a shallow pitched roof above and a full-story Italianate tower with corner pilasters and a shallow roof, replacing that front gable that used to be there. It was also in the 1880s that the large smokestack that used to be on the back of this building was removed and partially boxed in. And by the 1920s, the boxed in smokestack is completely gone. And I think this was done in part in the late 1870s. Sprinkler systems, the automatic sprinkler head is invented, and insurance companies started to force mill companies to install these types of sprinklers because fire was such a hazard. And I believe this is in response to that. We know in the 1880s, the standpipe that used to be up the hill was put in to feed that sprinkler system. And it looks like they were increasing production space, but also, making the mills a safer place to work. And one of the things that also has come to light is there are now a set of insurance maps, like the one that I'm showing you here, that show the village. And this is half of the insurance map. The other half is footprint that tells a variety of information about the buildings and their uses. And you can see in this photograph of the mill agent, the map that I have above is hanging in a frame over his desk. You can just see the bottom half of it. And I'm not going to go into detail about the mill complex and how it was used. That would be a whole other talk. But I do want to say by the 1920s, the mill complex looked as it did, or as we know it today, although we've lost some buildings. You can see here's an insurance map from 1922. Here's our hydroelectric power plant. Here's storehouse number 4, which is now apartments. In the late 1890s, a centralized heating plant was added, which you can see here with the smokestack. Unfortunately, that building's now gone. And if you look around, you can see there's just this depth of information, including all of the buildings, the warehouses, and the mills owned by the company, you can see are divided by floor, and it tells you what operations are happening on each floor, each one of these maps, or it tells you what's being stored in that storehouse on each floor. So these are a wealth of information for a researcher, and they're now all at the OSHA Map Library up in Portland, Maine. So from here, I want to talk about the Boston and Maine Railroad Bridge, which is one of those iconic, when you think of Salmon Falls, you think of that bridge. And it's actually, for railroad buffs and for steel bridge buffs, which, they're out there, this is one of those, people come over to photograph it and they come to see it. And here you can see that bridge. Now, here's that map that I showed you earlier, but here you can see, again, this is what's now Church Street. Here's the Colonel Paul Wentworth House right up here. This is Main Street, and you can see in the up until the 1840s, the main road into town brought you down Church Street, and then you took this 90-degree turn to then cross over the bridge into South Berwick. But Salmon Street does not exist yet. Salmon Street doesn't come in until about the early 1850s, I believe. So from there, you either go left and follow the river, or you go right and follow the river. And the right to follow the river is what brought you down to downtown South Berwick, or what was then downtown South Berwick, and the left brought you along the river and on to Berwick, Maine. What I also want to show then, and you may not be able to see it, but faintly you can probably see this sort of, somebody lightly penciled in what became the railroad right-of-way right here. You can just see the lines. Now, the incorporation that would eventually become the Boston and Maine Railroad occurred in 1833 in Massachusetts, and the railroad connecting Boston, Mass. To Portland, Maine, crossed the New Hampshire border in 1840, reached Dover, New Hampshire in 1841, and was providing service to South Berwick, Maine by 1843. And the history of the town of Rollinsford, Catalfo claims, but without source, that the bridge was constructed in 1848, which doesn't comply with other sources that reference service to South Berwick and later to Portsmouth in the mid-1840s. Rollinsford resident and railroad historian Nelson Laurie provided the date of 1842 to Wendy Persig in her book, Place Names of South Berwick, for when the Boston and Maine constructed that first railroad bridge to cross the Salmon Falls River from present-day Rollinsford, New Hampshire to present-day South Berwick, Maine. The bridge not only spanned over the river, but also the roads that extended on both sides of the river. Unfortunately, that timber frame bridge was very short-lived. At 5 a.m. on January 9th, a fire started in an adjacent grist mill that destroyed the bridge with an estimated loss of approximately $10,000. There are no known images of that first bridge. The second bridge, which you see here in this tinted lithograph, was a 5-span wood lattice deck truss. This means the train traveled along the top of the truss as it does on the bridge in service over the river today. The bridge is technically a covered bridge. It is clapboarded to protect the wood truss that sits underneath. So what you're seeing here is sheathing, and under that is that lattice truss. For years, this was thought to be the first bridge over the Salmon Falls River, but as I said, we know from articles in the paper that indeed it is now known as the second bridge. The bridge, and you can see here, the photo to the left, you can see this is looking from South Berwick into Rollinsford. Here's the Rollinsford train depot, the steeple of St. Mary's. The bridge had parapet walls that rose above the deck with a gable roof protected by wood shingles. It spanned the river on wood supports, covered with flushboard siding, and you can sort of see them through the fence here. Those sat on granite block piers. The use of wood for a bridge at Salmon Falls was not surprising. The majority of bridges constructed by the Boston and Maine Railroad in the 19th century were of wood. Metal bridges were impractical for railroads in 1849 and did not become popular until the advent of Bessemer steel. Even with the growing popularity of steel bridges in the last half of the 19th century, the B&M continued to maintain its wood bridges, In 1895, the line's engineer, Jonathan Parker Snow, claimed approximately 70% of its line's bridges were constructed of wood, citing the lower cost of construction of wood as one of their economic benefits. And this brick monument that you see here, and it's actually marked on one of the maps of 1851 of the village as a monument. This is one of the unsolved mysteries of Salmon Falls. I don't know what it was a monument for. I've yet to uncover if it served some other purpose. It's on the 1877 lithograph, but we know by the late 1880s, it's gone. So if anyone has information on the so-called monument, please let me know. Now, in the 1880s, the Boston and Maine began expanding to a parallel two-line track from Boston to Portsmouth. From Boston to New Hampshire. On January 29th, 1887, the Boston and Maine announced its plans to raise the existing bridge over the Salmon Falls River in a few weeks. That was actually delayed by 2 years. They announced, though, that they had plans for an arch bridge of 6 stone arches with a total length of 400 feet to cost $150,000. The article also mentions, not surprising, that an iron bridge to cost $40,000 is also spoken of, but it's not decided which kind will be built. The plans were drawn by Mr. Ross, bridge engineer of the road, which is likely Joseph Ross of Ipswich, Mass., who worked on several projects for the Boston and Maine. Construction, as I said, was delayed for almost a year, and in 1888, the Boston and Maine constructed the more prudently priced iron bridge. The bridge was a 3-span Warren quadrangular deck truss or lattice truss, flanked by 2 deck plate girder approaches on its southern end. And I should say this photo is looking, if I was standing, if you were standing at the location of that photo, the Rollinsford train depot would be to your right. You're looking across the bridge to South Berwick, and the Great Falls and Conway depot, which survived until the 1990s, is right here in South Berwick in the distance. So the overall length of the crossing, I should say, in the 1880s, where am I going? Sorry, lost. The overall length of the crossing was shortened in the northern end with the construction of a new granite wall abutment closer to the river, and I'll show you that. This is the bridge that was constructed in the end that we know soon after it was completed. I was wondering, what would that stone arch bridge? Can you imagine 6 stone arches crossing the Salmon Falls River in that location? So I couldn't help myself. Using a stone arch bridge from a railroad bridge from Connecticut, New Hampshire, Connecticut, I sort of created this composite photo to give you an idea. Had they built the more expensive model, it would have been quite the sight to see. Although having said that, I do like the bridge that we have. Now here you can see in this, they're deconstructing, and here, this is a great photo. This is in the collection of the Old Berwick Historical Society. So here you have the granite piers rising up from the river within the wood supports that are covered in flushboard siding. And here's the bridge being deconstructed. So here you can see the lattice truss, and see at the top, you can see daylight. There's where the truss rises above the deck. And then over to the left, you can see the clapboarding that then protected that truss. And over to the right of the photo, you can see them building an abutment wall where they're shortening the overall span. Here's another view looking from South Berwick over to Rollinsford. Here's mill number 2 with its original roof line. And once again, you can see, you can see that whoa, I'm not sure what we're seeing, but anyway, you see the different images of this bridge being constructed. The expansion was, in the 1920s, the truss was strengthened with cross bracing to handle heavier trains expected to be used on the line, which is why when you see historic photos of the bridge, it looks so light like this one. You can't take a photo like this today because there's extra metal bracing that bridge, which gives the trusses a chunkier feel than when the bridge was first constructed. And the expansion was a catalyst for other changes in the village, including the demolition of the Episcopal Church built in 1830, and also the loss of Wentworth Street that crossed over the tracks. And here you can see the bridge abutment for Wentworth Street right here, where the grid of Salmon Falls used to cross over, now gone. And this is a nice segue into our next topic of St. Mary's, because here we have St. Mary's with its steeple. And notice that steeple for the 19th and part of the 20th century used to be variegated. It used to be two different colors going down. It was a much more Victorian looking building than what we have today with that color scheme. So, rethinking St. Mary's, we have some interesting information to present about St. Mary's, and I hope you'll appreciate this as much as I do, now better understanding what was going on in that building in the 19th century. And here we have St. Mary's probably around, and I'm not sure, somebody is drawing green lines on the screen. I'm not sure if other people see that, and I'm not sure how to remove them. But if you could not, that would be appreciated. So here we have St. Mary's with its steeple about 1890, 1900. Now in 1853, the company treasurer, Amos A. Lawrence, wrote, "The high cost of labor can and must be reduced for the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company." He then goes on to say, "This belongs to the duty of the agent, and undersigned is of the opinion that our present agent, Mr. Loudon, is compensate to do it. If he cannot, he will resign his place to another." So basically, he's telling the agent of the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company that they need to attract cheaper labor, and if he can't do it, then he needs to quit because they're going to hire somebody else who can. He then describes American girls as less reliable during the past summer, especially as they left their work to go home. So the mill girls who initially were hired to make this cloth are not as reliable. At the same time, though, with the railroad was constructed by the Irish, and the Irish coming into town were looking for jobs. The agent later responded to Pliny Loudon in this letter that exists in the Mass Historical Society's collection, that the Irish are bound to go to Dover unless the village can allow for a church and also establishments. And what he means by establishments are bars. Salmon Falls was dry at this time. And he then warns why both would be problematic to introduce, and stresses the need to keep the local girls and the Irish as separate as possible. It's a great letter. It's a hard letter to read because his writing is terrible, but it's an interesting letter going on about what's going on at that time period. That same year, Lawrence reports that the company had purchased a large house for $2,900, which will accommodate 100 boarders and will relieve the others which have been crowded. Built by Louis Stiles Block, located in what is today the parking lot for St. Mary's Church, was soon locally known as the Irish Tavern. So here we have the map of 1851, and you can see the building is owned by Louis Stiles. Wentworth Street is no longer there, or actually there is a street now where Wentworth Street is. It's now going to the new development. And then just to the left of that is the Colonel Paul Wentworth Mansion. By 1856, the building's now owned by the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company, as you can see in this map. And this is a really early, this is probably a circa 1865, 1870 photograph of Stiles Block. The need for a church was still stressed in company records. And in January of 1854, the directors reported, "Another requirement for the village is a Roman Catholic place of worship. Without this, the best class of Irish operatives will always give preference to the neighboring town and leave us. A communication has been had with the bishop of this diocese on the subject, and he has proposed to send a clergyman once in a week, fortnight, to offer the company's hall for the use of the Romanists. Although it has been used by the Methodist Society without compensation to the company for a considerable period, it's believed that the prejudice which would be created in the minds of the other operatives would be more injurious than the effort would be beneficial. information has been received that the Catholics of Berwick, in connection with those of Salmon Falls, have made a movement necessary arrangements. It's desirable they should act independently of the company, especially if they should undertake to locate a church building. There is bitter feeling against the Irish on the Berwick side of the river, which showed itself in a riot a year since. Any attempt to place the church in that place is known to be encouraged by the company, would meet with resistance. On the other hand, the location of a church on the Salmon Falls side would prejudice our own people and might induce some to leave. Styles Block was by this time filled with 100 tenants, and it was reported if the Irish should predominate as to discuss the American operatives, the character of the village must be very much changed for the worse. Every care must be taken to keep them in separate boarding houses and to separate them in the mills. The large boarding house lately purchased is some distance away from the others, and will be occupied by the Irish. Unfortunately, the other houses are near to each other and near the mills, and the separation of the hands is not made easy. Now, the incident in Berwick that they related to, that riot, is connected to a murder of that year. In June of 1853, the Boston Pilot reported Lewis Maxwell, a stable keeper, was murdered and a young man named Prey badly stabbed by two men named Waters and one Snell. The two former were found secreted in the attic, and Snell was found in the woods. The difficulty originated through an insult offered by the two Waters and Snell to a young woman. One night late last week, a mob of about 1,000 persons from Great Falls, Dover, South Berwick, and Salmon Falls, New Hampshire, assembled around the shanties. This is on the other side of the river, where you can see, if you see right around where Fogarty's and that area is. They gathered around the shanties near the spot where the murder of Maxwell occurred, and the Irish families therein, having moved out in accordance with previous notice sent to them by the mob, the buildings were demolished. Other disturbances were anticipated. The paper later reported an anonymous account of the attack from a self-described eyewitness who refuted claims of the local papers of Irish drunkenness being the problem and stated, "Sir, I will now endeavor to give you an idea, though yet a faint one, of the inhumane treatment which the Irish in general of Salmon Falls received from the Bible-reading Yankees of that and the adjoining towns on the night of the 2nd. A mob suddenly appeared in the streets and marched to the houses occupied by the Irish, and without any previous notice, immediately commenced a thorough demolition of the buildings, thereby leaving the Irishmen, women, and children, widows, and all as they were to take refuge in the woods or remain in the streets until morning. The yells and blasphemies of the mob whilst in the act of tearing down the houses and tossing the broken fragments of the furniture belonging to the Irish into the air resembled the howling of demons, of the distant roaring of wild beasts. Sam Dixon, the proprietor of one of the grog shops spoken of, was the commander-in-chief of the Bible-reading savages, and when the shanties were all broken up, Sam pointed out to them the other houses occupied by the Irish and was seen to fetch them out pails full of brandy several times that they might better be able to execute their devilish designs." And this is probably not far from the truth. There was incredible anti-Irish sentiment in this area and in the country in the mid-1850s. Here we have this page, and this page is the size of a newspaper, a normal newspaper page, in very fine print. It's a treaty from the American Party published as an extra for the Biddeford Journal on August 9 of 1855. The Know Nothing Party was, or the American Party, was primarily an anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, anti-immigration, populist, and xenophobic movement. That formed as a political party that gained a lot of steam and thankfully sort of lost it quickly as well. They were the original conspiracy theorists. They believed that the Pope was out to dominate the world and that the reason why the Irish were coming over was part of that evil plot and plan. They were known as the Know Nothing Party because they were part secret society, and when asked about their party and what they were up to, their common response was, "I know nothing," which, based on their politics, is probably not far from the truth. This treaty goes into all of the similar sort of stereotypes of immigrants. They're dirty, they're criminals. It's Europe dumping its unwanted on America. They don't love our country. We love our country. They hate our country. They're coming to change us. And through all of this, we have the final postscript where the writer wishes it understood that he draws a wide difference while speaking of foreigners in favor of those of the Protestant class who come here to enjoy liberty and not abuse it, who come here respecting and not hating our institutions, who are willing to move with and not against us as Americans, who detest papal domination and are not under its cursed and fiendish influence. And this type of rhetoric continued. I mean, we even saw it in the 1950s and 60s with the presidency of Kennedy, where people were worried that a Catholic president would give the Pope too much control in America. This sentiment wasn't just in Biddeford, it was also right here in our town. And you can see in 1855, the local papers announced that the election excitement is tense. Dover elects a know-nothing moderator by 245 majority. Rollinsford, Somersworth, and Newmarket also elect a know-nothing moderator by large majorities. So Rollinsford was a seat of know-nothingness. Now, the history of St. Mary's, any history of St. Mary's has relied pretty much on this 1929 booklet, which is the first published history of the church. It is interesting in that it makes a number of claims that have then been sort of taken at face value and then published in every subsequent history, like the ones that are shown here. And nobody's really stopped to look to see, like, is that true? And I think looking at it, there are some questions that have occurred that then make me realize we need to do some more research on some of the claims, because the person who wrote this was very confused. One of the things that the writer states is that Patrick Ford was the architect of the church. And Patrick Ford was a Boston-based architect who designed Catholic churches. There's no doubt about that. But Patrick Ford was born in 1847 in Ireland, which means that when St. Mary's was being constructed, Patrick Ford was 10 years old and still living in Ireland at that time, which means that he was either an extremely precocious child who was an architectural ingenue running a sort of business that was international, which is highly doubtful, or maybe there was another architect. And I'm thinking there was probably another architect. And we think we know who that is. Patrick Keeley, born in 1816, is probably the architect of this church. He immigrated to New York City in 1842. He designed his first church in 1849. He became noticed in when he was originally a builder, and he got noticed with the construction of St. Peter and Paul Church in Brooklyn, New York in 1846. And he designed over 600 churches along the Eastern Seaboard. He later partnered with James Murphy from 1860 to 1867, and also briefly worked in the early 1870s with Patrick Ford. And unfortunately, his collection of papers was destroyed by his daughter, so we don't have a full complement of his work. We do have churches that have been identified as being of his design, and through documentation, and it's through comparison of some of those that we can sort of start to draw conclusions. And I think one of the best comparisons is the St. Mary Church in Biddeford, no longer extant. It was demolished in the early 20th century. And if you look, those clasping buttresses that you see on the corner of St. Mary's, you see clasping buttresses here. The windows are a similar proportion that you have. The marble dedication stone over the door, same thing on this church. And then also, if you look, you have these parapet walls that then have this sort of return, this corbelled return. That same parapet wall with corbelled return exists on St. Mary's. If we look at the interior, unfortunately, there's no comparable to the interior of St. Mary's, really to other Keeley churches except for one. But St. Mary's and St. and Holy Trinity, the original Holy Trinity, were constructed at the same time. Here's Holy Trinity, and you can see Holy Trinity and St. Mary's were very similar. St. Mary's actually was finished first because there was a shutdown at the Great Falls Mills, which delayed by several years the completion of Holy Trinity. But look at the interior of Holy Trinity, which is the big photograph above, and you can see the sort of play of quatrefoils and triangles on these brackets. And then you look at, here's an example of the cathedral, St. Joseph's Cathedral in Manchester, New Hampshire, which is another Keeley church. And you have that same sort of play of trefoils and geometric designs. We see this type of design in other Keeley churches as well. An anomaly, and I can't remember where this church is, but this is the interior of another church. I love the ceiling, and see how the ceiling makes a trefoil in its design. And I provided a pointed trefoil arch design below. It's sort of a widened version of that. And if you look at, this is an interior view of St. Mary's, and I've highlighted in yellow that same proportion trefoil design. So knowing what we know and who is out there, St. Mary survives as an incredibly well-preserved example of an early example of Patrick Keeley's work. And to give you an example, this is St. Mary's as it appears today. And once again, I love these. These are just, it's a simple king post truss, but then you have made out of laminated beams, but then you have these Gothic arches with circle infills that just creates an incredible visual and architectural statement that is both elegant and simple at the same time. And I'm showing you this. This is a detail of the front of St. Mary's because this is how it looks today, but it looked very different at the time St. Mary's was constructed. These two big windows that you see flanking the cross were put in 1907, and we didn't know, what did it look like before? Were these plain walls? Were there other windows there? That was an unanswered question. What was the decoration? None of these things were known. The earliest photo I'd ever seen of the church was from the 1920s after two different redecorations that occurred on the interior. And then this is one of the benefits of the digital age. This lithographic print of the interior of St. Mary's dates to 1880. It is in the collection of Villanova University in Philadelphia and is part of the collection of the Catholic Historical Society. It is one of several different lithographs that date between 1875 and 1885, done by a Philadelphia firm of church interiors. Some of them were done as fundraisers. Some of them were done to celebrate major milestones. I think this was probably done to celebrate the decoration of the church interior. And it answers so many different questions. It documents accurately features that were changed in 1892 and 1907. And although the construction of St. Mary's was completed in 1855, the interior decoration in the majority of the stained glass was not completed until the 1870s. Important features to note include the decorative stencils and murals on the walls and ceilings, the original Stations of the Cross on the walls of the building, the early oil lamp chandeliers. We now know what we had for chandeliers in this building originally. That hang from the middle of each truss, the original wainscot, and the location of the door to the sacristy to the right, and the blind door for cemetery to the left. This door gets moved later on in the church's history. The lithograph also confirms that the church originally had box pews that were replaced with the current pews in 1892. We had Marie Donahue, who was the archivist, the librarian over at Berwick Academy, and a native of South Berwick. Her mother remembered had a memory that Salmon Falls originally had box pews. And we didn't have any proof of that other than we did find a pew door in the steeple when work was being done there. This now shows that, yes, indeed, the church had box pews, which is fantastic. A writer from from Dover, New Hampshire, reported on the July 3, 1858 dedication of the church, calling it a glorious fourth and for the Catholics of Salmon Falls, and noted the outside work is all completed with the exception of the tower. So the tower has not yet been completed, but all the inside work is yet to be done. The length of the church is 90 feet by about 40 feet wide and is built wholly of brick. The lot upon which the church stands was given free to the Catholics of that place, we learned, by the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company through their gentlemanly agent. I found this article and I was confused because everything we know about the church history said that the church did not receive anything from the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company. And in fact, everything we see, the information I gave you really sort of adds to that. So I looked around and found that indeed our correspondent from Dover was incorrect in some of his comments, and his report was not well received by the Catholics in Salmon Falls. A parishioner there wrote back a few weeks later that, I noticed a communication in which there is much misrepresentation as regards our church. Now, sir, and justice to our generous people who built the church, allow me a small space in your columns and let the truth be known. He says the lot upon which the church stands was given free to the Catholics of that place, as we learned by the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company through their gentlemanly agent. This, sir, is not true, as the ground did not belong to the company at all. The ground was bought and paid for out of the people's money. There was no lot for us to get from the company, and had they known of the lot being for sale, which we bought, they would have doubtless have paid double what we paid for it. But we were more fortunate, for we had $500 in cash. Your correspondent also says that all the inside work is yet to be done in our church. Now, sir, you will doubtless agree with me in saying that this is not so when I assure you that all the pews are in, also the furniture of the sacristy, which is neatly carpeted, as likewise the altar, which consists of marble and wood and is of superior workmanship, having been made in New York, which also the altar, which you see here being made in New York, is also leads credence to the church being designed by Keeley, because Keeley was working out of New York. Now he goes on to report, and this is where it also gets interesting. Together with 5 stained glass windows, 3 feet in diameter, and beautifully embellished with emblematic figures, which are set over the altar. The altar is well decorated at the cost of our unequaled young ladies. We have a large gallery out of which the door opens to the belfry. Of course, we have no bell yet, but we hope to have one soon. Now, 4 of those 5 windows survive today, and what's great is we can see that where they are, and also some of these windows have moved. So over the altar right here, right in the center, you see there's St. Mary holding the infant Jesus, which we have. To the left of St. Mary over the altar, we have a stained glass window representing the Trinity in a triangle, with the circle representing God the Father, the Son behind, which represents Christ the Son, and the dove representing the Holy Spirit. Over to the right, we have the 3 letters, that the JHS, which is the symbol for Jesus, which is right here. It still survives in the church, but moved to a different location. And then over the altar of Joseph, you have the lamb with its victory banner, still in that location. And then there's this quatrefoil stained glass window, which, when things shift in 1907 with the introduction of those 2 new windows that I pointed out earlier, that gets lost. What happens is the Trinity window gets moved to the quatrefoil location, and then this window, the emblem of Jesus, then gets moved to a circular emblem of wood that sat above the front door of the church, and it's still there today. What's interesting too is that these windows really do show that they are of the same time. They're different than the other windows. And if you look, you can see the blue field, the design on the blue field behind the emblem of Jesus is also behind the lamb. The trim, the border of the lamb window is the same as the border on the Trinity window, and the emblem window and the Mary window also have the same border. So these are all definitely from the same stained glass studio, from the same time period. And as we go forward, you'll see also very different from other windows. These are not the only stained glass windows, though, that survive in the church from when it was dedicated. The writer also goes on to state there are also 4 stained glass windows in the tower, one of which is 5 feet in diameter. Now, sir, what remains to be done of the inside work might easily be seen by a man with 4 eyes. I would also say that our church is 45 feet wide instead of 40 as mentioned. We hope to be able to resume the work on the tower very soon. And here you can see, these are the windows that he's talking about. Here's the big window that he mentions, that's 5 feet in diameter, which sits right here. You can see outside, inside view. There are 3 windows in the next level of the steeple that are, one of them is pictured here, and you can see the same colors that are in the same type of glass in this window as that. And then I just put this back here because here you can see the front door, and this window that used to be above the altar is now above the front door. And there you can see it again, and make that comparison. Now, the stained glass windows that were added in the 1870s are very different and reflect their time. If you look at those windows are an enamel. They're sort of a painted design that's then baked onto the glass. And if you look at this sort of design that forms the background, these are definitely a product of the aesthetic movement. The aesthetic movement began in the mid-19th century over in England with John Ruskin. And then William Morris was another proponent of the aesthetic movement. It's the early beginnings of the arts and crafts movement in the United States. And, you know, it favored floral designs and had this sort of quirky look about it. And it affected everything. It affected wallpaper, it affected book covers, it affected carpets, it affected furniture design. And here you can see a panel from a piece of furniture, a book cover, a wall border stencil. And if you look at those flowers and those leaves and that very stylistic design, and you look at the window sample that I provided for the windows at St. Mary's, these are definitely windows that are post mid-19th century and are more of the 1860s, 1870s time period. And we know these are from the 1870s. They're different than the windows that we now know were there in 1858. And just to show how detailed this lithograph is, you can see here the window of St. Peter, and to the left, the window of St. Michael. And here are those windows. It's amazing the level of detail in this little lithograph. And what's great is you can also tell that these windows and this interior design were of the same design, because here you have the lamb with the flag. Here's the lamb with the flag on the painted ceiling, but then the Sacred Heart of Mary on one of the windows, the Sacred Heart of Mary on the ceiling, the chalice with the Eucharist, And then one of these, here's the peeking behind the beam, the crown with the sword, and the crown with the sword. So the windows and the ceiling decorations are done at the same time, and they play off each other. They're using the same motifs and the same designs. Now, in 1892, the church was again updated. The stenciling and altars were kept in place, but the work that was done in 1892 included the following. The floors, including all of the original beams and joists, were completely removed, and a partial basement was dug for a central heating system. So when you're in St. Mary's today, the floor that you're walking on is a totally new floor. And this is a picture from 1898. And you can see that the interior, the painting that was done, the interior decoration was left intact. You can still see those 3 windows. The altar, the original altar is still there. This is mostly communion rail, and other things. A new floor was installed with new pews and new baseboard. And this is a recently uncovered and restored floor around the altar, which I believe dates to 1892. And then it also includes new beadboard wainscot. That's the wainscot that's still there today. The new pews, and also the new lights. And this is the original electric lights for the church that you can see right here in this image. And all of this work was completed for $5,000. And the statue of St. Anne, I'm not sure if this is, it's very similar. So I'm not sure if this statue from St. Anne's was restored. It has a tag that says says 1940s. I'm not sure if it was restored in the 1940s or if it is a different one, but it looks like there was a very similar St. Anne statue in that 1892 photo that's still in the church today. And in 1907, the church was completely redecorated. The stenciling was redone. And they added these windows flanking the altar. And then on the east wall, they added these big circular windows. And you can see these sort of reflect changing tastes and once again have more of a Tiffany look to them. They also serve to add a lot more light into the church, which would have been very dark, especially before these circular windows were added above the choir loft. And also sometime in the 20th century, either in 1907 or in a redo of the church in the 1920s, the electrical lights that are there today still, which are fantastic Art Deco lights, were added at that time. And the ones in the center of the church still hang off of the original hooks that were installed for those kerosene lanterns. And then finally, just to wrap up, the church experience. Here's the church in 1942 after its 1920s rehab. You can see altar furniture that's been added that doesn't really work with the architecture of the building. They repeated that same mistake in the 1940s when they redid the church. Once again, redoing the stenciling, and once again, the altar sort of bisects over stained glass windows. And then the last major rehab was in the 70s, where they simplified the church and painted everything at one point endless shades of taupe. That's since been turned into a two-tone green color, but that is the last sort of major rehab of the church. But in that, they replaced the altar furniture, they got rid of the stenciling, but they did keep the pews, the wainscot, the lights, and other pieces of the church. And I'll close with this. The discoveries just keep coming in. I was at Old Berwick Historical Society this week, and Norma Keim hustled out these photographs of that were donated recently. They're copies of original photographs. The earliest one I could date right then and there was circa 1865, 1870. Some were early 20th century. I almost didn't take a photo of this building of the church because I'd seen this view before, but I thought, well, I'm there, I might as well do it. And I'm glad I did, because once I got home, this is probably the earliest exterior view of St. Mary's that I've ever seen. It dates to pre-1875. We know it's after 1863 when the bell is put into place and the steeple is finished, but before the work is done to decorate the church. And how we know that is, if you look closely, those are all operable sash windows on the church. You can see all the windows are open. The stained glass windows don't open like that, never open like that. It would be fun to run this through a scanner as opposed to taking a picture of it with a camera to see if we can get a better idea if this is a typical sash, if there's a frosted glass design on it. The other thing that's interesting is this, what I'm assuming would have been an oil lamp over the door that is gone in later photographs of the church. So nice early image. And it also shows that that variegated spire was something that was original to the church's construction. So I will now stop sharing my